The moon didn't care what it was doing to Kenjimura. It never had. It was just a rock, a dead thing hanging in the black, bouncing borrowed light down through the porthole of Outpost Nakajima's observation deck. And Kenji had long since stopped, pretending that made the pain any better. He pressed his forehead to the cold composite glass and breathed, slow and deliberate, the way Dr. Yashiro had taught him. In through the nose, hold it, out through the mouth. Ignore the itch crawling up the inside of your spine, like something trying to crack its way free from the bone. It had been 17 months since the Karag Veth hit Fukuoka. 17 months since Kenji had been close enough to a Veth energy lance to feel the discharge rewire him from the inside out. The field medics had written it off as acute radiation syndrome. Standard protocol, flush the marrow and hope for the best. But the marrow came back wrong. The tissue came back too thick. The bones came back denser than any scan had ever recorded on a living human body. And when the first full moon rose over the recovery ward, Kenji had put 4 soldiers through a wall before they could sedate him. He was the only confirmed case. The Veth energy lance, the science team theorized, had done something to the deep regulatory sequences in his cells. Not damage exactly, activation. Like finding a lock no one knew was there, and turning a key that had no business existing in human biology. He tried not to think about what that meant about him. On the other side of the observation deck, Captain Rina Tazawa sat in the dark and watched him. She'd been assigned as his handler 9 months ago, after the 3rd incident, and she'd made a professional point of never flinching when the change started to come on. Kenji respected that more than he could put words to. She had a thermos of tea that she wasn't drinking, and she was watching him the way you watch a door in a building you think might be on fire. Calm, not yet moving. How bad, she said. Manageable. He pulled his forehead off the glass and turned around. His knuckles were already wrong, too thick at the joints, the tendons pulling against the skin in ways that cast small shadows. Give me an hour. Don't have an hour. She held up her tablet. The screen threw blue light across her face, and he read the data before she could narrate it. Krog Veth seismic signature, Class 7, bearing in from the Tsushima Strait at 23 kilometers per hour. They're heading for the Hakata fusion core. Intelligence says this one's a Karagveth Prime, a planet eater, the real thing, not a scout. How big? 200 meters. She said it the way you say something that shouldn't be real. Give or take. Kenji turned back to the window. Below the station, what was left of Japan's coastal defense grid was lighting up. Railguns along the seawall, automated intercept platforms warming their targeting systems, the distant thunder of JSDF carriers repositioning in the strait. He had watched them fire on the Veth before. He had watched everything humanity had built for war hit a Karag Veth and bounce. Going to send me, he said. It wasn't a question. Behind him, Reina was quiet for 3 full seconds. General Kira is already preparing the deployment orders. Tell him I need the moon. Kenji, I'm not asking for permission. Shh. He closed his eyes and felt the thing in his blood push against its own edges, patient and enormous, like a tide that had been told to wait. I'm telling him what I need. The change is faster under direct lunar exposure. Stronger. You know the differential from the last 3 trials. She knew it. She had written most of it. The change under simulated light took 11 minutes and left him at 60% estimated capacity. Change under the actual moon, with nothing between him and that dead rock's reflected pull, 90 seconds, and left him at something. The instruments had eventually stopped trying to quantify. The lab's structural load sensors had simply read error, and the researchers had quietly upgraded the test chamber. He heard her typing. I'll tell him, she said. Get your gear. He didn't have much gear. That was the thing nobody made films about. Bureaucratic comedy of trying to outfit something that wasn't going to be the same shit in 40 minutes. The field kit was essentially a vest with locator beacons sewn into it, designed to survive the change and broadcast his position, and a pair of reinforced tactical trousers that would split cleanly at the seams rather than cutting off circulation as the legs thickened. Everything else he wore would be destroyed. He'd gone through 17 pairs of boots in 9 months and stopped keeping track. He dressed in the dark of his quarters, moving from memory. There was a photograph tucked under the edge of his bunk. His mother, a festival, Hakata Tower in the background, Before any of this, he didn't look at it. He'd learned not to look at things he might not get back to. In the corridor outside, a young corporal saw him coming and went very still against the wall. Kenji nodded at him. The corporal nodded back, with the particular quality of nod you give something you are trying hard not to be afraid of. Kenji kept walking. Akata Fusion Core was 60 kilometers south. From the station's roof, he could already see its glow on the horizon. That particular pale blue that meant clean deuterium burn. The thing that kept 11 million people with power and heat. The thing the Karagveth navigated, by the way sharks navigated blood in water. They didn't eat fusion cores exactly. They absorbed the output, the raw thermodynamic overflow, drank it through their ventral intake membranes, the way a whale drank krill. And what was left was a crater and a great size. And the particular smell of ozone that Kenji had first encountered over Fukuoka and never quite forgotten. He could already smell it now, faint on the wind from the south, and something deep in the rewired architecture of his blood answered it like a tuning fork. Rena found him on the roof. She had a radio headset pushed up to her temple, and a look on her face that he'd learned to read as controlled urgency. She had changed into her field jacket at some point, the one with the JSDF patch on the left shoulder that she'd worn since her first posting in Nagasaki, and had never swapped out even when regulations changed the design. He had never asked about it, and she had never explained it. He approved it, she said. The deployment, extraction package is standing by at coordinates Hotel 7. If you can drive it back toward the industrial reclamation zone on the eastern coastline, away from the population corridor. I know. There are 40,000 people on the evacuation trains right now, she said it simply. No theater in it. The Yodogawa line, the Sanyo Shinkansen, the southern platforms are still loading. He looked at the horizon. The blue glow was brighter now, and around it, the sky had begun to shift in the way the sky shifts before weather, before something large moves through it. There was a sound just below the range of comfortable human hearing, a frequency the Veth produced when they fed or prepared to feed, like the hum of a transformer before it blows. How long until it reaches the core? 52 minutes at current pace. And the trains? She checked her tablet. Her jaw was very still. Last platform clears in 68. Okay, Kenji said. He took off his boots, he always did. Now, as a small private ritual against wastefulness, and set them neatly by the roof access door. He checked the locator vests. He looked out at the horizon one more time, at the blue and the dark, and the thing moving through the strait that was bigger than anything that should be alive. Rena. She looked at him. He thought about saying something that would be worth saying, something she could keep. He had drafted a dozen versions of it over 9 months. At 2 in the morning when the pain was bad, and the change felt close, and the world felt like a place he was holding together with his bare hands. He had never gotten any of the drafts right. Everything he tried to put into words came out smaller than what he meant, like trying to fit the ocean into a glass. And after a while he had concluded that this was simply a limitation of language rather than a failure of feeling. Don't let them fire on me by mistake, he said. She almost smiled. I'll do my best. He turned to face the moon. It hit him the way it always did. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once. A switch thrown at the cellular level, every regulatory sequence in his body dropping its arguments and standing aside. The pain was there. It was always there. A white static that came from the bones remodeling themselves in real time. The muscle fibers, thickening past anything on the human scale. The cartilage in his hands, hardening into something closer to the Veth's own chitin than to human tissue. He had asked Yashiro once if the change was trying to make him into them. And Yashiro had said she didn't know. That had not been reassuring. 93 seconds. He'd counted, once. When it was done, the roof was rubble beneath him, and he was no longer a person who fit through doorways. Far below, he could hear the city. Not the panic. There would be panic, there always was. The sirens and the running and the bright animal fear of people understanding that the scale of the problem had just revised upward. He had learned to hold that sound at a distance, to keep it as information rather than weight. If he let it become weight, it became something else. And the change had a quality he had not yet mastered. It made grief feel like rage, and rage in this shape had a radius. He moved south. The transit corridors he had memorized in advance, because that was the kind of salaryman he had been, and the kind of soldier he had become. Methodical, planful. The person who reads the briefing document twice and marks the relevant sections. At his current scale and pace, 60 kilometers was 20 minutes, give or take. He had learned to navigate terrain this way. The highway corridors first. The industrial causeways, the reclaimed land, along the bay that had been built precisely for the kind of infrastructure that nobody wanted near, neighborhoods. The engineers who planned Japan's coastal industrial belt in the post-war years had done so with a particular quality of foresight that also be read as pessimism. They had assumed that something large would sometimes move through, and they had arranged accordingly. He appreciated that about them. He appreciated a lot of things about people who planned for the worst, without telling anyone they were planning for the worst. The Veth signal was stronger from the ground level. He could feel it now as a vibration in the changed architecture of his skull. A low harmonic that the original human hardware in him read as danger, and the rewritten hardware read as something more complicated. Orientation, maybe. The way a bird reads magnetic north. The Veth Prime was generating a feeding pulse as it moved, clearing the electromagnetic spectrum ahead of itself, the way a ship clears a bow wave, and the new receiver that his biology had become was parsing that pulse with a precision that should not have been possible. He could feel where it was. He could feel which way it was turning. There was something in the signal that carried intent, at least the structural echo of intent. The Veth equivalent of a thing moving through a crowded room with a fixed destination, incurious about everything that wasn't the destination. It was not hunting. It was not angry. It was feeding the way a planet feeds a moon. Gravity, through the unsentimental mathematics of mass and proximity, without anything so personal as malice. That, in some ways, was the hardest thing. Malice you could negotiate with, even if only in the abstract. You could appeal to malice's ego, flatter it, redirect it. The Veth felt toward humanity was nothing. Not contempt, not hostility, not the cold satisfaction of a predator. They simply had not updated their models to include the relevant variable. He was the relevant variable. The first JSSDF railgun emplacement opened fire on the Karag Veth at the 17-kilometer marker, and Kenji watched the hypersonic slugs impact the creature's dorsal carapace from 5 kilometers away. The impacts left marks that disappeared within 30 seconds. The Veth's auto-repair biology proved the same system that made conventional weapons a nuisance rather than a deterrent, cycling through damage at a rate that had humiliated every military engineer who'd tried to model it. The rounds were hitting hard enough to leave craters in reinforced concrete at that velocity. Against the Prime's carapace, they left impressions roughly equivalent to thrown gravel. The emplacement kept firing anyway. He respected that too, the stubborn commitment to doing the thing even when you could see it wasn't working. Because stopping felt worse than trying. People at that emplacement had families and breakfasts and conversations they'd been in the middle of. And they were standing at a railgun and firing at something that couldn't feel them fire. And they were doing it because it was the thing they had been given to do, and the only way they knew to put themselves between the people they loved and the thing coming for them. He understood that very well. He closed the remaining distance at a run. The ground shook under him as he moved. Not through him, but under him, which was a distinction he had never entirely gotten used to. He was the source of disturbance now, rather than the recipient. Twice he had to adjust his route to avoid ground that would have given way beneath his weight, the soil density insufficient for what he had become. And both times the detour cost him 40 seconds he didn't have, and he ran the math, and concluded he still had margin, barely. He had met the Veth once before, at human scale in the processing tent at Fukuoka, when the lance had discharged and everything went white. And once before at this scale, in a controlled engagement over the Nagasaki containment zone that had lasted 11 minutes and ended. When the change ran out of whatever fuel it ran on, and he came back down to size in a parking structure in Isahaya, bleeding from 17 places he couldn't entirely account for. Max had found him sitting against a parking barrier, holding his left hand, which had been doing something that hands were not designed to do, and when they asked him if he was all right, He had said he thought so, in the careful way of a person who has discovered that the answer might be more complicated than the question anticipated. That had been a scout, 30 meters, young, disoriented, moving without purpose through a residential district in a way that suggested it had lost signal from the main collective and was operating on some kind of autonomous feeding instinct. This was something different. The Karagveth Prime emerged from Tsushima Strait at 22:14, and Kenji got his first clear look at it as it crested the seawall, and the floodlights of the coastal defense grid lit it from below. Was structured, nothing that had evolved on Earth. That was always the first thing that struck him, even now, even in this shape. The wrongness of the Veth's geometry, the way its body refused to resolve into any category of living thing that the inherited library in his brain had a name for. It was bilateral in the loosest sense, with a main axis that might be called a trunk. The appendages branching from it followed a logic that was not vertebrate, and not insect, and not anything that had walked this planet. The head, if head was the word, carried the intake membranes along its lower third, fanned open now in a wide fringe that pulsed with the same frequency Kenji had been tracking, tasting the fusion core's output on the electromagnetic wind. Its eyes, if they were eyes, distributed across the upper carapace in an irregular pattern, each one a different size, and they caught the floodlights and held them like a mirror catches sun, throwing cold reflected light back in every direction. There was no pupil, no iris, no depth to them. They were optical organs of a fundamentally different design, taking in a spectrum of information that had nothing to do with what human eyes were built to read. Kenji had once asked Yashiro what the Veth saw when they looked at things, and she had said something technical about electromagnetic sensitivity ranges and then had been quiet for a moment, before adding that she didn't think they saw things the way we meant when we said seeing. The Prime was trailing bioluminescence from the straight water, lines of blue-green light running down the locomotive segments as the salt water dried on its carapace, and in the floodlights, this gave it the appearance of being lit from within, as though something larger than the body were shining through it. He had a complicated response to that visual. Part of his brain registered threat, part registered something closer to awe, and the part that was currently running a body 200 meters long registered target. It was, in the technical language of the Defense Ministry briefing documents, a Class 7 consumption event. It was also, in the language Kenji thought in when he was standing at the same scale as it, and 30 meters was the gap between them. Enormous. He hit it in the lower thorax, the region below the intake fringe that the xenobiology team had flagged as the soft juncture between the feeding apparatus and the locomotive segments. He'd been briefed on this in the car on the way down. Raina, reading from the tablet while he tried to hold himself together in the back seat, her voice level and professional, like a navigator reading coordinates. The lower thorax was not unprotected, but it was less armored than the dorsal carapace, and the impact sent the Prime stumbling sideways into the seawall, with a sound like a building falling, which was also exactly what it looked like. The Veth Prime turned its upper segment toward him. The distributed eyes caught him and held. There was a moment. There was always a moment, where the alien thing regarded the human thing, and did the alien equivalent of processing that information. Kenji had discussed this with Yashiro, who had pointed out that from the Veth's perspective, what they were looking at was also deeply wrong. Something the size it was, moving the way it moved, casting the biological signature it broadcast. Whatever the Veth used for a cognitive model of threats, he did not fit into it. He was a category error. He was the thing that was not supposed to be there. He hoped that gave them something like fear. The Prime struck first, a sweeping blow from one of its primary appendages that caught him in the left shoulder and drove him into a concrete overpass support hard enough to crack it through. The overpass groaned and shifted in a section of elevated roadway, empty, the evacuation having already redirected traffic, tilted forward and came down in a cascade that threw dust in every direction. He felt the impact as a dull percussion. The changed tissue absorbed it the way a sandbag absorbs a punch, through sheer mass and density, and came back off the concrete immediately, not giving himself time to assess the damage, because assessment was the enemy of momentum. Reina's voice, tiny and clear from the locator vest's embedded speaker. You're 6 kilometers from the industrial cordon. East is clear. East. Pushing it east. Away from the fusion core, away from the evacuation corridors, into the reclaimed industrial land, where the only things to break were things that were built to be broken, eventually anyway. He got under the Prime's intake fringe and pushed. This was not elegant. This was not the kind of combat that got illustrated in briefing materials or commemorated in monuments. It was close and grinding, and it smelled like ozone, and the Veth's biological chemistry was nothing like any smell on Earth. Sulfurous in the way of deep hydrothermal vents, with something sharp and electrical underneath. The smell of a biology that ran at temperatures no terrestrial organism could survive. He pushed it the way you push a stalled vehicle up a hill. Forward, nothing reserved, the screaming of your own muscles becoming background noise you simply stop listening to. The Prime fought back. Of course it fought back. It wrapped 2 appendages around him and applied pressure, and the new architecture of his bones held, but barely. The structural limits of whatever the Veth Lance had rebuilt him into being tested in real time. He could feel things bending that were not meant to bend. He filed that information under later. They were moving east. Not quickly, not cleanly, consistently. He was larger. And whatever law of physics governed large things shoving slightly larger things, the equation was in his favor when he kept his legs moving. In his earpiece, below Reina's calm dispatches, he could hear the thin sound of the evacuation broadcast on the Yodogawa Line's platform intercom. He recognized the tone, if not the words. He had heard that tone once before, standing on a platform in Hakata, with a briefcase in one hand and coffee going cold in the other, watching the trains load out while the sky to the north went the wrong color. The woman on the intercom had a voice that sounded like someone trying to be steady for the sake of the people who needed steadiness, and she was doing it even though she was afraid. You could hear the steadiness costing something. You could hear underneath it the maintenance of the voice, the effort of not letting the fear through, because the fear would be contagious, and there was no time for contagion. He had stood on that platform and listened to her voice, and felt something very specific, a kind of protectiveness that was not romantic and not familial. Just the clean human impulse towards something doing a hard thing well in a bad moment. And he had never found her name, never known who she was. He thought about her sometimes. He thought about her now, in the middle of it, which was exactly the kind of thing the change did to him. It stripped away the editorial layer between the thinking and the feeling, left the emotional data raw and unmediated, so that a salaryman from Fukuoka was wrestling a planet-eater with both arms while thinking about a woman he'd never met who had done a small brave thing on a train platform 3 years ago. The human things you carry into the wrong shape. Prime found purchase on the ground and stopped moving east. He felt it change tactics. There was something unmistakably intelligent about the Veth, a quality that could be mistaken for instinct but was more deliberate than that, the recalculation of a problem when the first solution fails. It shifted its mass low and angled toward his legs, trying to leverage him off-balance the way you might lever a boulder by working underneath its center of gravity, and it very nearly worked. He went to one knee, and the ground under the knee sent cracks through a reclaimed industrial car park in a 300-meter radius, and the Prime began to pivot back toward the fusion core. He caught it by the trailing edge of the locomotive segment. He had not known he could do that. Yashiro would have found it very interesting. He caught it, and he held on, and for a long, terrible moment it pulled against him, and he was a salaryman from Fukuoka, who had worked in logistics and liked ramen and called his mother every Sunday and kept his apartment very clean, and once spent 4 hours helping a neighbor find a cat that turned out to have been inside the whole time, and his bones were lit from the inside by something no human science had put a name to yet, and the Karagveth Prime was 200 meters of alien apex predator that had consumed 7 planets before it found this one, and none of that information, Kenji decided, was more relevant than the simple physical fact that he was not letting go. He had grown up in a neighborhood where the old men still talked about the post-war years with a particular quality of voice. Not proud, not sad, something more durable than either. The voice of people who had found the bottom and discovered it was not the end. His grandfather had been one of them. A small man who said very little and rebuilt very much, who had the specific stubbornness of someone who had been told by events that stubbornness was not enough and who had concluded that events were incorrect. He had never said this out loud. He had simply continued to build things when the building was finished. Kenji thought, in the way you think under extreme physical duress, without sentences, in something more like weather, that his grandfather would have understood this moment. Not the scale of it, not the biology of it, but the essential action, the holding on, when the holding on made no obvious difference to anything except the fact of itself. Stubbornness, that doesn't look like. Stubbornness because it looks like every small, ordinary thing people do when the world is too large. And they are not large enough to fix it from above. He redirected. That was the word for it. The word Yashiro had used after the Nagasaki engagement when they were reviewing the footage and trying to understand why the scout had not simply overpowered him. Redirection. Not strength against strength, but leverage, momentum repurposed. The judo principle operating at a scale the people who invented judo had not anticipated. The prime was pushing west toward the fusion core. He was holding the trailing segment. The geometry of it. If you applied the correct rotation and committed to it fully and did not stop even when your vision went white with the effort of it. The prime came over and down in a long arc and impacted the industrial reclamation zone with a sound. The seismograph station in Kyushu University would later record as a 4.2. The impact threw industrial debris in a radius of half a kilometer. 3 warehouses that had last been inspected for occupancy 48 hours ago and found empty sent a pressure wave through the ground that was felt as a tremor as far north as the evacuation platforms. The intake membranes were exposed. The soft juncture between the feeding apparatus and the locomotive segments was exposed. Kenji was already moving. He held it down. This was again not elegant. It was the 200-meter equivalent of a wrestling pin, conducted in the ruins of a coastal industrial estate at 23 minutes past 10 on a Tuesday. The kind of thing that you cannot plan for and cannot adequately describe afterward to anyone who wasn't there. Prime fought with everything it had. And it had a great deal, and the things bending that were not meant to bend were bending harder now, and the shoulder from the overpass impact was beginning to send a more urgent class of signal, and he filed all of it under later with greater urgency than before. In his earpiece, trains, southern platforms, Reina's voice, then focused. Kenji, the Senyo Shinkansen is passing the coastal marker. It's in range. He understood what she was telling him. The trains ran along the southern coast corridor, 10 kilometers north of the reclamation zone, elevated on stilts above the bay, and a Karagveth prime that got free of him at this moment would cover that distance in under 3 minutes. He had been to that coastal corridor once on the train going the other direction, watching the bay water from the window, while a small girl in the seat ahead of him drew pictures on the condensation on the glass with her fingertip, and then erased them and drew different ones. He did not know who she was either. He thought about her too, now, in the raw and unmediated way the change brought everything to the surface. He did not let it go. Precise biology of what happened next was something Yashiro spent 11 months writing papers about. The short version, the one Kenji gave when asked, was that the Veth energy encoded in his own tissue recognized what it was looking at and responded accordingly. Like an immune system, he said, though that wasn't quite right either. More like a lock that had been waiting a very long time to encounter a specific key, and the key was the biochemical signature of the Karagveth's intake membrane in a disrupted state, exposed and vulnerable. The defensive chemistry compromised by the impact and the sustained pressure of the pin. The Veth had hit him with a reading beam over Fukuoka 17 months ago. The xenobiology team had documented 3 types of Veth energy emission. Feeding pulse, which was the low harmonic he'd been tracking tonight. The locomotion field, which was the system that allowed them to manage their own mass efficiently. And the reading beam, which was the signal they used to assess biological targets. They had sent a reading beam at him, and the reading beam had found something in his cellular architecture that it recognized, or that recognized it, and the exchange had gone in a direction the Veth had not intended. What he was doing now, pinning the Prime with its intake membranes exposed, was feeding that exchange back. The change had always been a response to the Moon, which was simply a source of the same electromagnetic spectrum in which the Veth's reading beam operated. The Moon wasn't causing the change. The Moon was triggering a response that the change had encoded for a very different trigger. He was not a weapon the Veth had made. He was a weapon the Veth had accidentally taught its own target to become. The energy discharged in a pulse that the JSDF radar stations recorded as an EMP event, and immediately tried to attribute to the Veth, because the alternative was more complicated. It lasted 4 seconds. The Karag Veth Prime's intake membranes sealed themselves, shut in an automatic, defensive response to the signal, the biological equivalent of closing a door against a burning house, and in doing so, cut off the feeding mechanism entirely. A Veth that cannot feed, cannot regulate its own body temperature. The xenobiology team had known this, theoretically, for 3 years. They had never expected to have experimental confirmation. The Prime began to cool. 22 minutes. And for 22 minutes, Kenji held it down, in the reclamation zone, with everything the changed architecture of his body could bring to bear, and it fought him every minute of those 22. Because the Veth were many things, but they were not, as a species, inclined toward surrender. He had a dislocated shoulder by minute 4, and what would turn out to be 3 fractured ribs by minute 9. Something deeply wrong with his left knee by minute 17, and none of that mattered in the way that would make him stop. He had found, over 17 months, that the things he carried into the change did not leave him while he was in it. He had worried about this initially, worried that the thing the Veth had activated in him would overwrite what was underneath, burn the Kenjimura parts away in the same process that restructured the bone and muscle, leaving something functional but empty. He had shared this worry with Yashiro, who had told him with her characteristic precision that the worry itself was evidence against it. "You don't worry about losing yourself," she had said, "if the self is already gone." So he carried everything with him into the 22 minutes. Carried his mother's face in the photograph. He carried the old men in his grandfather's neighborhood with their post-war voices. He carried the woman on the train platform, who had kept her voice steady for strangers. He carried the small girl drawing pictures on a train window. He carried Raina's thermos of tea, kept warm for 6 hours without comment. He carried the corporal in the corridor, who had nodded back at something he was afraid of, because it was the polite thing to do. He carried all of it, and he held on. When the Prime finally went still, the silence was enormous. It came in layers. First, the sound of the creature itself going quiet, the deep subsonic hum of the feeding pulse dying as the intake membranes sealed to permanent shut. Then the cessation of its movement, the enormous mechanical sound of 200 meters of alien biology stopping. Then, more gradually, the sounds of the damaged landscape settling around them, creak of stressed steel, and the slow collapse of things that had been waiting for permission to fall. The blue bioluminescence that had traced the Prime's locomotive segments was fading to gray, and then to nothing, and the only light was the floodlights of helicopters arriving overhead, and the distant blue glow of the fusion core, which was still burning, unchanged, indifferent to what had almost taken it. He became aware slowly of the sound of helicopters. A lot of helicopters. The JSDF had a protocol for this situation, or they had written one after the Nagasaki engagement, which had been close enough to this situation that the protocol writers had apparently decided to plan for recurrence. Searchlights swept the reclamation zone in interlocking arcs, and somewhere among them was Reina's command aircraft. And somewhere else was a medical team that had gotten very good at treating injuries that had no standard triage category. The change was already reversing. It always did, in the aftermath, the biology resetting itself to something closer to baseline, the bones remodeling back toward human geometry, the added mass redistributing in ways that his body seemed to negotiate with the laws of physics. Protest. The pain during the reversal was different from the pain during the change. Slower, deeper, a full-body ache that felt like having been taken apart and reassembled by someone working from a translation. Like every cell in his body was finding its way home from somewhere it had never intended to go. And finding it room by room, and being tired about it, he sat down in the rubble of the car park. The rubble was fine gravel beneath him. What had been a concrete surface, reduced by the engagement to its component materials. And he sat in it, the way you sit down when the sitting is necessary rather than chosen, and he put his hands on his knees and breathed. In through the nose, hold it, out through the mouth. Below him, spread across several acres of reclaimed industrial land, the Karag Veth Prime was cooling. The intake membranes had sealed to a permanent shut. The xenobiology team would later determine that the seal was irreversible, that the pulse had triggered an autonomous defensive response, that the Veth's own biology could not override, a system designed to prevent overfeeding that had been turned into a death sentence by its own logic. The final irony in the long ironic chain of events. The Veth had encoded a vulnerability into themselves, and then had handed a human the key to it by accident, because they had run a survey of the local fauna and not bothered to wait for the results. Kenji did not know that yet. He just sat in the rubble and breathed, and waited for the helicopters to figure out where he was. Freena's voice came through the locator vest speaker, which had somehow survived. Trains cleared the southern platforms 40 minutes ago. He processed that. He had counted, roughly, the 22 minutes of the hold, and the transit time down, and the engagement before the pin, and the math worked. The trains had cleared the coast corridor before the Prime had gone down. The 40,000 people on the evacuation platforms were on trains, and the trains were on the northern lines heading inland, and the lights inside those trains were on because the fusion core was still burning. "The core?" he asked. His voice during the reversal was not entirely his voice. It was the version of his voice that the change left behind in its retreat, lower and rougher, and with a quality that even he found difficult to listen to. Intact. The coastal defense grid is repositioning. We have forward elements tracking 2 additional signatures in the strait, but they're small. Scouts, not feeders. Nothing else like this one. Nothing else like this one. The helicopters were circling. He could see the lights of Reyna's command aircraft descending, separating from the others, coming toward his position. The medical team would be somewhere in that cluster. People with the specially modified equipment and the specially modified protocols and the particular quality of professional calm that came from being very good at a job that no training had prepared anyone to be very good at. He looked at the sky. The moon was still there, indifferent as ever, doing its work on his blood, with the same cool inattention it had brought to every other thing it had ever done. He had a complicated relationship with the moon. He was working on it. He thought that over time, when the change became more familiar, when the architecture of what he'd become felt less like an intrusion and more like a feature, he might come to some kind of peace with it. He did not expect it to become simple. He expected it to become manageable, and manageable was enough. In 4 hours, they would airlift him to the Nagasaki Recovery Center, and Yashiro would spend 2 days running every scan her equipment was capable of, and several it technically wasn't. And the papers she wrote would not be approved for publication for 18 months, and the Defense Ministry would classify the relevant portions under protocols with acronyms Kenji was not cleared to know, and he would go back to Outpost Nakajima, and there would be a debrief that lasted 6 hours and a commendation that he was not permitted to display publicly, and life in that particular bureaucratic machinery would continue, as it always did, because the machinery had to continue. But that was later. Right now, a woman in a helicopter was descending toward him through the searchlights with a medical pack and a thermos of tea that she had been carrying for 6 hours and never opened, and she dropped into the rubble beside him and sat down without ceremony, the way she did everything, efficiently and without performance. And they looked at the cooling body of the thing that had come for 11 million people's lights and warmth and found something in its way that it had not known how to account for. "You're a mess," Reyna said. "Yes," Kenji agreed. She passed him the thermos. He took it carefully. The reversal was still running, the hands still not fully reliable, the joints still thick at the knuckles, though they were thinning minute by minute, and held it with both palms, the warmth of it traveling up through tissue that was still in places not quite human. The shoulder is dislocated, she added. I know. Something happened to your knee. I know. She looked at the Veth Prime's sealed membranes, the cooling carapace, the thing that had consumed 7 worlds before this one. Her expression had the quality of a person doing math they hadn't expected to have to do, recalculating a problem that had seemed one size and turned out to be another. He had seen her wear that expression twice before, and both times what came after was something important. Yashiro's theory, Rina said. The one she filed last month, about the pulse encoding. I read it. She thinks it's not random. The Veth lance that hit you in Fukuoka. She thinks it was a scout's reading beam, that they were doing a biological survey of the local fauna before they sent the prime. Kenji was quiet for a moment. She thinks they found a species they already had data on, he said. And they made a mistake. She thinks the reading beam found cellular structures it recognized from another system. A species the Veth had surveyed somewhere else in the last few thousand years and then moved on from, because the assessment came back indicating insufficient resistance. Reyna paused. But the structures had been dormant, and the beam activated them. They woke something up. Yes, and they didn't wait to see what. That, Reyna said, appears to have been their mistake. The wind came in off the strait, carrying the last of the ozone and the alien chemistry and the salt smell of the sea, and, somewhere to the north the city was beginning to assess itself. The way cities do after something large has moved through nearby. The checking of what remains. The accounting of what doesn't. The process of understanding how close it was. How close it always was. Fragile geometry of everything continuing. The lights on the grid. The trains on the rails. Children in the evacuation centers, waiting for the all-clear, the woman on the platform intercom, who had been steady for strangers. He thought about his grandfather's voice. He thought about the specific quality of stubbornness that doesn't look like stubbornness. He thought about a photograph under the edge of a bunk, and a thermos of tea that had been kept warm for 6 hours by someone who had said nothing about keeping it warm, had simply kept it warm, because that was the kind of thing you did when the alternative was not doing it. These were human things. They did not translate. The Karagveth could model 1,000 variables in an enemy: size, temperature output, energy signature, structural density, electromagnetic profile, locomotion speed, defensive chemistry. They had been doing tactical assessment across a dozen solar systems, and they were very good at it. The intelligence they brought to this kind of work was real, and it was formidable. And it had served them well across 300 light years and 18 planetary systems and more consumption events than any human archive had managed to reconstruct. They had not modeled for this. Not for the salaryman who kept his boots by the door. Not for the captain who kept the tea warm through 6 hours of waiting. Not for the grandfather who rebuilt in a neighborhood that had been told it was finished. Not for the stubbornness that looks like ordinary behavior because it is ordinary behavior, fabric of a species that had found the bottom repeatedly, and concluded repeatedly that the bottom was a beginning rather than an end. Not for the way a human brain, in extremis, fills itself with the faces of strangers. A woman on a train platform, girl drawing on glass, and finds in those faces not a reason to grieve but a reason to hold on. The Veth had modeled the biology. They had not modeled the person inside it. They had surveyed the cellular structures and found dormant capacity, and filed a report and moved on, because the fauna had seemed insufficient. They had looked at a planet of ordinary people, doing ordinary things, and not recognized what they were looking at. Had not understood that the stubbornness encoded in the DNA was the same stubbornness encoded in the rebuilt house, and the voice kept steady on the intercom and the boot set neatly by a door before facing something too large to face. They had crossed 70 light years to feed. They had not asked what was here. Kenji Miura handed the thesser back to Marina. He looked at the moon. He let out a long breath, slow and deliberate. Shh. The way you breathe when the pain is bad but manageable. Which was a distinction he had learned to make carefully over 17 months of practice. In the specific and patient way, you practice the things you are going to need to be good at for a very long time. I'm going to need new boots, he said. Reyna looked at him for a moment. Then she did smile, the full version, the one he had seen exactly 4 times in 9 months. It changed her face the way opening a window changes a room. 18 pairs, she said, but who's counting? In the east, first gray light of dawn was finding the horizon. The city was already running its damage assessment. The trains were moving again on the northern line. 11 million people were beginning the morning with their lights on and their water hot and their ordinary lives intact, which was not a small thing, which was in fact the largest thing there was, which was the entire point of everything that had happened in the last 93 seconds and the 22 minutes after it. Reyna signaled the medical team. Somewhere above, a helicopter was descending with the things they needed. The equipment, the protocols, the patient and skilled people who had agreed to become good at a job that should not have existed. Kenji sat in the cooling rubble, with the thermos warming his palms, and breathed the ozone salt air of a coastline that was still there, still intact, still attached to the rest of everything, and waited for the sun, as it always had, to come up. Above them, indifferent as ever, the moon began to set. There was paperwork. There was always paperwork. The debrief started at 0600, 6 hours, after Kenji sat in the rubble of the industrial estate and drank Reyna's tea, while the medical team immobilized his shoulder and taped his lips and told him things about his left knee that he received with the patience of someone who had been receiving unwelcome medical information for 17 months. He signed 17 incident reports. He answered questions from 4 ministries, a university research team, and a general who had spent 30 years preparing for the wrong threats and was now in the uncomfortable position of encountering the right ones. He answered everything honestly. That was the only approach that made sense. 3 weeks later, Yashiro called him in for a conversation that was not technically a consultation. She had the 11-month paper on her desk, and beside it a new document, much shorter, written in the careful language of someone drawing. A conclusion they were not entirely comfortable drawing. She told him what the pulse had done. Not to the prime, that was already documented, to him. The discharge had been in both directions. Signal he had sent to close the membranes had run in reverse through his own tissue, and in doing so, it had settled something. The reading beam's activation of his dormant cellular structures had left them in a state of ongoing excitation for 17 months. A key, perpetually turning in a lock. The feedback had resolved it. The change will still occur, she said. The moon, or a Veth energy signature, either will still trigger it. The biology is permanent. But the ongoing excitation has resolved. The baseline pain between changes. The management should be significantly easier. He was quiet for a moment. In defeating a planet eater using the biology it accidentally gave me, he said, I also accidentally fixed the worst part of what it did to me. Yashiro considered the phrasing. That is essentially correct. He thought about that for a long time. He thought about it in the early hours, when the pain that had characterized every night for 17 months was noticeably and almost shockingly absent. He thought about it the way you think about something large and unexpected and good. Requires a different kind of processing than the bad things. You have to make room for it. On a Thursday in late October, Reyna found him on the roof. She had her thermos. The strait below caught the stars and held them cold and clear. 2 more signatures overnight, she said, still at depth. Yashiro thinks they're recalibrating. Yashiro is usually right. He nodded. The moon was rising over the water. He felt it in his blood, the quiet knock of it, and he breathed through it the way he had learned to breathe through everything. In through the nose, hold it, out through the mouth. Not a trick anymore. Just the way you breathed when the thing you were carrying was large and you were teaching yourself, day by day, to be large enough to carry it. He was still the person who set his boots by the door. He was still the person who called his mother on Sundays. He was also the thing that had held a planet eater in the reclamation zone for 22 minutes while the trains cleared the coast. He was working on holding both of those things at once. It was slow work. It was, he thought, the work of a lifetime. The Veth were out there in the dark water, recalibrating. He was here, breathing. He thought that was, on balance, the better position to be in.